It was a quiet morning on the ranch, the kind of morning where the mist clings to the tall grass and the horses graze lazily under the rising sun. Life out here was peaceful, exactly why I bought this place 10 years ago. 40 acres of land, a weathered red barn, and a modest house tucked far enough from town that the only sounds were the rustle of the wind and the distant whinny of my horses. That peace was shattered the moment I opened my mailbox. Inside was a single, crisp envelope stamped with bold black letters, Sunset Ridge Homeowners Association. I frowned, turning it over in my hands, confused. My ranch wasn't part of any subdivision. I'd made sure of that when I bought the land. I wanted freedom, not rules about paint colors and lawn heights. Still, I tore the envelope open. The letter inside was cold and formal, accusing me of multiple violations of community guidelines and warning of fines if I didn't remedy the infractions within 30 days. They listed complaints, unapproved structures, excess noise from livestock, and even unauthorized fencing modifications. I stared at the page in disbelief. None of this made sense. My property was miles away from the neatly lined streets of Sunset Ridge. At first, I thought it had to be some clerical error. Maybe they'd mixed up addresses or hired some lazy surveyor who didn't check the property lines. I tossed the letter onto the kitchen counter and tried to forget about it. But the next week, another letter came. This one was more aggressive, stating that daily fines were being accrued until I complied. The week after that, a third letter arrived, filled with legal jargon about potential liens and forced compliance. It was no longer just a mistake, it was harassment. I tried calling the number listed at the top of the letter. No one answered. Just a robotic voicemail asking for my case number, followed by the beep of a full inbox. I left a polite message, explaining that my ranch was outside their jurisdiction and asking them to correct their records. No response. By the following Saturday, the situation escalated. I was out by the barn repairing a loose gate when I noticed a white SUV creeping up the gravel road. It stopped just outside my gate, and two women stepped out. Clipboard wielding, sunglasses perched high on their noses, the type that screamed HOA patrol. They didn't wave. They didn't speak. They just started snapping photos, my barn, my fence, even my horses grazing in the field. I shouted to them, asking what they were doing, but they ignored me, turned on their heels, and sped away before I could reach the gate. That evening, another letter appeared in my mailbox. This one accused me of hostile behavior toward association representatives, and warned that if I interfered with their inspections again, they would involve law enforcement. My blood boiled as I crumpled the paper in my hands. I spent the rest of the night digging through county records. Deeds, surveys, tax maps, anything that could prove what I already knew. My ranch sat well outside the Sunset Ridge boundaries. The next morning, I mailed them a certified letter with copies of every document. I made it crystal clear that they had no authority over my property and that further contact would be considered harassment. For a moment, it seemed to work. The letters stopped. No more SUVs appeared at the gate. The ranch went quiet again, and I convinced myself that maybe, just maybe, it was over. But then, 2 weeks later, the flashing lights came. I was sitting on the porch that evening, a glass of sweet tea in hand, when red and blue lights cut through the twilight. A county sheriff's cruiser rolled up my driveway, tires crunching against the gravel. Two deputies stepped out, their hands resting on their belts, their faces serious. They told me they'd received a complaint from the Sunset Ridge HOA. According to their report, I was violating community regulations, refusing to comply with notices, and had allegedly threatened association officials. I tried to explain, showing them the same paperwork I had mailed weeks earlier, but one of the deputies simply nodded and said they'd file a report to keep on record. As they drove away, the glow of their taillights disappearing into the darkness, a cold realization settled over me. This wasn't just a misunderstanding anymore. This was a fight. And I had no intention of backing down. The night the deputies came was the night I decided to stop playing nice. I'd been patient, reasonable even, giving the HOA every opportunity to correct their so-called mistake. But now, with law enforcement rolling up my driveway on the basis of false reports, It was clear that this wasn't about confusion. This was about control. Someone in Sunset Ridge thought they could intimidate me into submission. They didn't know who they were dealing with. The next morning, I gathered every piece of evidence I could find. Deeds, surveys, official letters from the county, all proving, beyond any doubt, that my land was outside their jurisdiction. I organized everything into a thick binder and drove to the county office to have the boundary records certified. The clerk behind the counter raised an eyebrow when I explained the situation, muttering something about that HOA causing trouble again. By noon, I had a stamped, notarized document in my hands that confirmed what I already knew. The HOA had zero authority over my ranch. But just when I thought I could finally breathe, they struck again. A few days later, I woke up to find a bright orange notice tacked to my front gate. It was an official citation from the HOA, claiming they were imposing daily fines for non-compliance. They even threatened to place a lien on my property if I didn't pay. That's when I realized this wasn't just harassment, it was escalation. I called the sheriff's office again, this time armed with my documentation. The deputy I spoke with seemed sympathetic, admitting they'd had multiple complaints filed by the same HOA against other property owners, but without proof of harassment, their hands were tied. So I decided to build my case. Every letter they sent, I scanned and filed. Every visit, I recorded with security cameras I'd set up around the property. Every phone call, or attempted phone call, I logged in detail. My quiet little ranch had turned into a fortress of documentation. Then came the second visit. It was early afternoon when I saw another white SUV creeping up my driveway. Two different HOA representatives stepped out this time, clipboards in hand, walking the perimeter of my fence like they were inspecting livestock. My dog barked from the porch, tail rigid, as I stepped outside with my phone recording in hand. They didn't speak to me. They didn't even look my way. Just scribbled notes, snapped more photos, and retreated to their vehicle. Minutes later, they were gone. By that evening, I had another letter in my mailbox, this one claiming I had obstructed an official inspection and threatening to involve law enforcement again. The absurdity of it all was almost laughable. Almost. I wasn't afraid of the HOA. What concerned me was their persistence, their refusal to acknowledge reality. It was as if they thought if they pushed hard enough, I'd eventually roll over, hand them a check, and follow their ridiculous rules. But that's not who I am. I started reaching out to neighbors, some in Sunset Ridge, others in the surrounding county. That's when I began to hear stories, eerily similar stories. Ranchers, homeowners, even small business owners who had been targeted by the same HOA for everything from unapproved exterior paint to unauthorized livestock. Some had fought back and won. Others, worn down by the constant pressure, had given in, paying fines for rules that never should have applied to them. That wasn't going to be me. I took my binder of evidence to a local attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense guy who dealt with property disputes before. He took one look at my documentation and shook his head in disbelief. The HOA, he explained, was banking on intimidation. Most people didn't have the time or money to fight back. But I had something better than fear, the truth, and proof to back it up. With his help, we drafted a formal cease and desist letter, warning the HOA that further harassment would result in legal action. Copies were sent to the HOA's board, their attorney, and even the county records office. For the next 2 weeks, everything went quiet. No letters. No visits. No SUVs creeping up the drive. I started to think maybe the storm had finally passed. But then, late one night, I caught something on my security cameras. Headlights, just past midnight, moving slowly up the road. The same white SUV, stopping at the edge of my property. A figure stepped out, walked up to the gate, and appeared to pin something to it before driving away. The next morning, I found another notice fluttering in the wind, this one marked final warning in bold red letters. They claimed I had 30 days to comply or they'd escalate enforcement. I stood there, the paper crumpling in my fist, a fire building in my chest. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was about principle. About standing up to bullies who thought they could trample over anyone they pleased. If they wanted a fight, they were about to get one. And I wasn't planning to lose. The morning after that final warning notice, the ranch didn't feel like home anymore. Every sound, the crunch of gravel under tires on the distant road, the rustle of the wind through the trees, felt like an intrusion. It wasn't fear, not really, but something heavier. A sense that I was under siege on my own land. I refused to let that feeling take root. Instead, I doubled down. I reviewed my security footage frame by frame, documenting the late-night visit in detail. I noted the time, the date, the make and model of the SUV, and even the license plate number that my cameras managed to catch in the glow of the headlights. I saved everything in multiple backups, one on my computer, one on a flash drive in the safe, and one in cloud storage. The attorney I'd hired shook his head when I showed him the new evidence. This was harassment, plain and simple. He suggested we file a formal complaint with the sheriff's office, not just for harassment but for trespassing. And that's exactly what we did. When the deputies came out again, this time I was ready. I had my paperwork laid out on the kitchen table, my property maps highlighted in neon yellow to show the clear boundary lines. The deputy, a younger guy this time, studied everything carefully, his brow furrowing deeper with every page he turned. He promised to file the report and escalate it if the HOA continued to ignore the legal notices. For a few days, things were quiet. Then, on a Thursday afternoon, the peace shattered again. I was hauling hay to the barn when I heard the rumble of an engine coming up the drive. When I turned, I saw two sheriff's cruisers pulling in, lights flashing. I dropped the bale where I stood and walked toward them, every muscle in my body tensed. This time, the deputy said, the HOA had filed an official complaint, claiming I had erected unapproved structures, kept dangerous animals, and verbally assaulted board members. They said they had to do a welfare check and document the property. It was humiliating, standing there on my own land while they photographed my barn, my fences, even the horses grazing quietly in the pasture. The deputies weren't hostile, but they were thorough, taking notes as though I really was some dangerous neighbor who had been terrorizing a suburban cul-de-sac. When they finally left, I stood alone in the driveway, anger burning hotter than ever. Enough was enough. That night, I sat down at my computer and started writing. Not to the HOA, not to their board, not even to the county, but to every local news outlet within driving distance. I sent them everything, the letters, the videos, the police reports, the certified documents proving I wasn't in their jurisdiction. I laid out the story in full, plain language, daring someone to ignore the absurdity of it. 2 days later, my phone rang. A reporter from a local station wanted to cover the story. By the end of the week, a news van was parked at the end of my drive, the reporter standing there with a microphone, filming the horses in the pasture as I explained everything on camera. The story blew up almost overnight. Neighbors who had been harassed by the HOA started coming forward, sharing their own experiences, stories of intimidation, bogus fines, and threats that never should have been made. The HOA had been running unchecked for years, bullying anyone they thought they could push around. But now, their tactics were exposed. I'd like to say the coverage embarrassed them into backing off, but the truth is, it only made them angrier. Within days of the story airing, another certified letter arrived, this one from the HOA's attorney. It accused me of defamation and demanded a retraction. My own attorney laughed when I showed him the letter. He said it was nothing more than another scare tactic, and advised me to ignore it while we prepared to take them to court for harassment and trespassing. Meanwhile, the support from the community was overwhelming. Neighbors stopped by to offer words of encouragement. A few even offered to testify on my behalf, sharing their own run-ins with the HOA. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I wasn't fighting this battle alone. But the HOA still wasn't finished. One night, just after sunset, I caught movement on the edge of my property. Through the security cameras, I saw two figures walking along the fence line, flashlights cutting through the darkness. They stayed just long enough to take a series of photos before disappearing back down the road. When I checked the footage later, my stomach turned. These weren't the usual HOA patrols. These were private security contractors, armed, wearing tactical vests, and carrying radios. The next morning, another letter appeared in my mailbox. This one claimed that due to ongoing hostility, the HOA had engaged additional enforcement measures. They warned that if I continued to violate community standards, further legal remedies would be pursued. That was the moment I realized what this had become. It wasn't just about boundary lines anymore. It wasn't about fines, or rules, or even control. This was war. And if they thought they could scare me off my land, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. By the time the private security showed up, I knew the HOA wasn't just testing the waters anymore. They were in full attack mode. Every letter, every visit, every false report had been an escalation, a slow boil meant to corner me until I gave in. But I wasn't about to give them that satisfaction. The first thing I did was call my attorney. I forwarded him the footage of the armed guards pacing my fence line, the photos I'd taken of their vehicle plates, and the latest threatening letter. His voice was steady but sharp as he laid out the plan. We were going to court. Not just to file for a restraining order, but to launch a civil suit for harassment, trespassing, and defamation. That same week, I filed formal complaints with the county and the sheriff's office, attaching every shred of evidence I had. I wanted this on record, every incident, every visit, every threat. No one could claim ignorance now. The story caught fire again. The local news that had covered my initial fight with the HOA returned, but this time, the coverage went statewide. Clips of my ranch aired on morning broadcasts, and online forums exploded with outrage. Strangers flooded my inbox, offering advice, legal connections, and even donations to help fund the legal fight. But the HOA didn't back down. 2 weeks after the story broke again, they filed their own lawsuit against me, claiming I had defamed the association and caused irreparable harm to their reputation. They demanded tens of thousands of dollars in damages and a public apology. If they thought that would scare me, they'd badly miscalculated. My attorney countersued. He built a case so airtight that even the most seasoned HOA board member wouldn't be able to squirm through it. Every certified map, every notarized deed, every second of video footage, it all painted a clear picture. They had no jurisdiction, no authority, and no legal ground to stand on. While the legal battle brewed, life on the ranch became tense. Every evening, I checked my cameras before bed, scanning for headlights creeping up the road. Every morning, I inspected the property line, making sure no one had tampered with the gates or fences. My once peaceful home now felt like a battlefield. Then, just when I thought things couldn't escalate further, they did. One afternoon, while I was out by the barn, I heard the rumble of engines, not one, but several. I turned to see 3 SUVs, all marked with the HOA's logo, pulling up just outside my gate. Men in uniform, not police, but private contractors, stepped out, armed and stone-faced. They announced, loudly enough for the cameras to catch, that they were there to enforce compliance. I didn't engage. I didn't yell or step forward. Instead, I walked calmly to the porch, set my phone on the table, and called the sheriff's office. By the time deputies arrived, the contractors had left, but not before leaving another bright orange final notice pinned to my fence. The deputies didn't need an explanation. They'd been watching this situation spiral for weeks, and now, they were ready to act. Within hours, a restraining order was filed against the HOA and its board members, prohibiting them or their hired contractors from setting foot on my property again. The court date came faster than I expected. I'll never forget walking into that courtroom, binder of evidence in hand, as the HOA's board members sat smugly on the other side of the aisle. They looked confident, like they'd already won. But as the proceedings began, that confidence started to crack. My attorney laid everything out, the certified property lines, the legal notices they ignored, the harassment reports, the news coverage, even the footage of their hired security trespassing on my land. Every detail painted them not as an association upholding community standards, but as bullies drunk on power. By the time it was over, the judge's ruling was crystal clear. The HOA had no legal claim to my property. They were ordered to cease all contact, remove any records listing my ranch as part of their community, and pay my legal fees in full. The board members left the courtroom pale and silent. The drive back to the ranch that day felt different. For the first time in months, the tension that had knotted my shoulders finally began to ease. The fields looked brighter, the air lighter. My home, my sanctuary, was mine again, free of their shadow. But the victory wasn't just for me. Neighbors from Sunset Ridge began to rally after the ruling. They demanded accountability from the board, new elections, and transparency in their dealings. Within months, several members of that same board had resigned under pressure, their power finally broken. I could have walked away at that point. Let it all fade and return to the quiet life I'd fought so hard to protect. But instead, I stayed involved, helping others navigate their own fights with overreaching HOAs, sharing my story so no one else would have to endure the same nightmare. And through it all, the ranch thrived. The fences stayed strong, the horses roamed freely, and the quiet that had drawn me there in the first place finally returned. Sometimes, late in the evening, I'd sit on the porch, a glass of tea in hand, and think back on those long, tense months. About how close they'd come to breaking me, and how, in the end, they'd underestimated the one thing they could never control, my refusal to be bullied. Because out here, beyond their neat little neighborhoods and their power-hungry rules, my land is my land. And that's something no HOA will ever take away again.